Maxwell, you can view the live stream. You're a coward.
Hi, sorry I'm late. I'm here and good to go.
It's okay. Nobody else is here.
Okay. I know. We've all judged that.
So how's everybody's day going?
Does this normally happen for someone who listens to music this loud?
I don't know. It depends on how loud the music is.
Like right now.
I think I've heard it this loud very, very often. I've heard it like once or twice. Sometimes you hear the parking garage that goes hard.
There's someone in the parking garage just like blasting music.
Yeah, that parking garage goes hard.
Oh, you mean that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that what that is? I guess
No.
it is Saturday.
No, it's not that. I don't know what that is.
It's
You're not in the debate room with the massive Maxwell up on the projector.
Yeah, I wish.
They don't give it to us every tournament.
Yeah. Tron is a benevolent but inconsistent god.
Hey, do y'all know if these rounds are gonna get like posted on YouTube and stuff like that after they're done?
I think so. I don't know.
Okay. Lit.
That's a question for the hubs. The hubs. Where's Kevin?
Oh yeah, wait, we lost.
Kevin's gone. So. Oh. Is Kevin?
It's a phone number.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, it would not let me log in, so I had to go through the phone. But this is Kevin.
Okay. Can you hear us okay? Are we good?
Yeah, that's all good.
Okay. If everybody's here, is anybody not ready for the AF?
Give me just like 30 seconds. Sorry.
Forever and ever. That's a comforting thought.
Yeah, don't say anything you don't want out there, Alex.
Yeah, sure.
I'm just gonna reel you back in.
I'm good to go.
Okay. Too many debate rounds on YouTube, Just get them off. All right. Plan is the United Nations should increase emergency relief fund relief to Haiti. It's the res. Advantage 1. First uniqueness is the United Nations credibility is low. The A argument is perceptions of the United States, Russia, and China have independent powers have decreased the international credibility of the United Nations and the unity that the United Nations actually holds. That the argument is the failures of 20th century peacekeeping missions in Rwanda or others cause skepticism. The United Nations can accomplish its job. The C argument is bureaucratic and inefficiencies shall action. The United Nations is seen as a body that does nothing and only talks about things. The link is the first. The plan increases credibility. The A argument is makes good on promises to stop international crises, particularly particularly natural disasters. The arguments this ensures perception that the United Nations will step in, is maintained. Particularly this makes good on the promises that the United Nations can have emergency relief funds, or will react quickly, or necessarily will be able to respond to crises. The C argument is this key to offsetting the failures of peacekeeping, and relief aid is necessarily popular within the international community. The impact. First impact is going to be pandemics. The A argument is that COVID proves the WHO and the United Nations is necessary to stem the impact of coming pandemics. The B argument is this accelerated infections will kill billions. Underserved, particularly underserved individuals without hospital access and medical equipment. The C argument is extinction events are not isolated. Multiple mutated superbugs are more resilient, and transmission becomes easier as those mutations occur. Containing superbugs will require a global unified response, and absent a global unified response, this absolutely fails and kills everybody. The D argument is that I'll just read neatness. The zoonotic diseases are absolutely increasing the status quo. Particularly, this is proven by the H5N8 virus, which killed a bunch of people, or has been detected in Russia. Also, the Nipah virus, which has some greater than 90% kill rate. The second impact is going to be global warming. The A argument is individualized movements necessarily fail. Particularly, the only a global response will be able to actually stop the climate change. Even if one country pollutes enough to kill us all, that would still cause extinction. The B argument is measurement is absolutely key. This is already seen, particularly in the Paris Accords and the IPCC, are necessary to not only create objective measures about what climate change occurs, and but also create global goals that every state necessarily has to be able to shoot for. The C argument is climate change necessarily causes extinction. The heating of the oceans causes eutrophication, which causes algae bloom die-off cycles, which choke out all phytoplankton, which is responsible for 90% of the oxygen on the planet. Second advantage. Uniqueness number one is Haiti is being destroyed by natural disasters. The A argument is located on unstable seismic fault. This is the center of what's called the hurricane belt. The B argument is between 2004 and 2008, 3 major hurricanes and a tropical storm killed 3,000 people, and hundreds of thousands were thrown into homelessness. The C argument is in 2010, 1.6 million people were left homeless, and 200,000 people died after a 7.0 magnitude earthquake. The D argument is an earthquake in 2021 killed 2250 and left another 650,000 people homeless. The E argument is it will get worse in the future. There more heat and water in the atmosphere and warmer surface temperatures of the oceans increases the speed and intensity of tropical storms, and upgrading those two hurricanes necessarily becomes very, very common, and will increase in intensity and speed in the future. The link. First is UN aid is necessary key to stopping major death. The A argument is this ensures food and medical supplies flow in for displaced populations. The B argument, the United Nations is poised to do so. Their aid networks necessarily span the globe and constitute a multinational effort, which is necessarily always going to be better than individualized responses, particularly because the United Nations can call on multiple operational procedures. The C argument is the United Nations aid operations operate under standard operating procedures that make efficient aid delivery and distribution. The D argument is this empirically proven. Hundreds of thousands were clothed and fed by the United Nations after last August earthquake. The impact. One is natural disasters annihilate basic human rights for disadvantaged communities and reinforce the politics of invisibility. The A argument is that absent assistance, natural disasters disproportionately affect rural and disadvantaged communities. The B argument is poor areas lack technology to anticipate coming disasters, alarms, evacuation resources, which cause disaster recovery to be more expensive within these disadvantaged populations and underserved countries. The C argument is that natural disasters make vulnerable populations even more vulnerable, particularly those who participate at the risk of or at the margins and fragile informal economies. This includes individuals who operate small roadside shops and salespeople and fishermen who operate necessarily on a day-to-day basis. These are those who are going to be most affected by natural disasters, particularly because they live on coastlines and they're necessarily close to they have a very low amount of standing savings. This the argument is disasters are likely to wipe out marginal actors' livelihoods and leaving them unable to reestablish their livelihoods. The argument this implicates human rights, particularly of those of women and children who are disproportionately affected by natural disasters. The F argument is the lack of medical supplies, housing, and assistance programs deprive marginalized individuals of the right to be treated with dignity. The underview. Interpretation, evaluate the round as a pragmatic policymaker above all else. Evaluate the round as a pragmatic policymaker above all else. The first justification is being a pragmatic policy, this is the definition, is being a pragmatic policymaker is evaluating what can physically and rationally be taken based on the powers and resources that exist in the status quo. The second argument is this constrains the ballot the best and ensures that hypotheticals do not become impossibilities. The A argument is utopian fiat, evaluating advocacies that cannot happen renders discussion useless. The B argument is creates debate centered around the worst impacts and not actual actionable solvency. Third argument is policymaking good. A is discursive rejection fails. It gets ignored, but politicians cannot be adopted due to resource disparities and people who don't care about what doesn't happen to them do not actually implement any discursive rejection. The B argument is the affirmative doesn't preclude a discussion. The affirmative framing doesn't preclude discussions about outside of policymaking. It just ensures that policymaking won't necessarily be the endpoint of discussion. The C argument is policymaking is absolutely key to resistance strategy, particularly. This is why understanding your enemy is necessary to be able to defeat your enemy. The D argument is rejecting policymaking sees the political to fascist elements or elements who necessarily want to commit reactionary violence. The fourth argument is that this is best impactful to the A argument is that impacts of the status quo come first, particularly that more links in a chain, i.e. 50% links in a chain make a probability of the terminal impact 25%. This is the multiplicative effect. The B argument is international relations are unpredictable and impossible to create link chains off of. The A argument is going to be Arab Spring was caused by one guy self-immolating immolating himself, which created this massive revolution. And this indicates that there's no way to be able to predict the changes in international relations or the changes in which people, necessarily create different international context, like revolutions and such.
Okay, 2 minutes. Could you just restate your last argument about like how it's impossible to predict like international conditions? Like, what's the offensive implication of that for the round?
It just means it's an impact framing argument.
How so?
You should evaluate impacts of the status quo and things we can predict over international relations context.
Okay, cool. Okay, it'll be 1 in case.
Is it one off? Sorry.
1 off, yeah.
Okay.
Is anybody not ready? First is the critique. Settler colonialism describes the process by which the settler class seeks the total elimination of indigeneity, such to establish the total naturalization of the settler as native in the colony, which is the only way to concrete the legitimacy of the colonial project, because the very existence of the native is an existential threat to the power of settler governance and control. Depictions of indigenous peoples as savage or barbarous prove because such propaganda was used to justify continued colonial expansion to tame indigeneity in the frontier, or to justify projects of erasure like boarding schools, and is used today to justify imperialist military interventions in places like the Middle East or Africa. There are 2 axiomatic truths about colonial violence that are critical to successful combat against it. First, that the process of settler colonialism can only be understood as the unification of anti-blackness. Settler colonialism and capitalism is inseparable and mutually reinforcing systems. There are 3 examples that prove. First is that capitalism and the need for profit necessitated colonial expansion into the Americas, which necessitated black slave labor to exploit resources, which accelerated accumulation of wealth in the colony, which allowed further violent colonial expansion westward. The second is that the capitalist for unpaid labor, in part causing the anti-black process of mass incarceration. Third is that imperialist military power projection by settler states creates the conditions for capitalist exploitation and extraction of resources places like Africa or the Middle East, like when the U.S. went to war in the Middle East, such to sort of secure favorable conditions for oil exports. The second truth is that settler colonialism is a world system. Settler states like the U.S., Canada, and European powers banding together to do things like A, establish NATO to combat states seen as a threat to global functioning of capitalism like Russia, B, conduct coalitional wars in the Middle East to protect the extraction of resources like oil and other settler states like Israel, C, is coordinate and perfect global accumulation of capital via institutions like the IMF and G20. The affirmative sort of greases the wheels of the system. The link is disaster capitalism, efforts to incentivize and perfect modes of international cooperation and aid are the way in which neocolonialism operates, the colonial controlling of countries in the global south under the auspice of assistance and development. It's specifically true in the context of the AF for many reasons. The multilateral aid of the AF inevitably comes with preconditions for receiving nations to submit to that require giving massive influence to the U.S. and European countries through mechanisms like supplying economic information, the lowering of trade barriers, protection of private investment, and supply of raw materials to imperialist countries, which means that while the AF operates under the guise of aid, it is in reality a project of sustaining and perfecting the markets of capitalism, such to grease the wheels of Western exploitation of countries like Haiti. Haiti, specifically true in this context, according to the UN itself, emergency relief is used for development, like to do things like clean up tourist spots, which proves the link and decreases their solvency on the second advantage, because it means that not all of the money is going to be used for actual humanitarian aid. A lot of it's going to be used to do shit. A lot of it's going to be used to do stuff like develop the country, quote unquote, in ways that are sort of seen as beneficial to global capitalism, to global capital in general. Sort of Western countries intervening or sort of providing quote unquote aid to countries like Haiti is absolutely disastrous. A cholera outbreak in 2016. I'm going to give a bunch of examples. A cholera outbreak in 2016, which was linked to UN peacekeepers in Haiti, killed at least 10,000 Haitians and sickened another 800,000, according to New York Times. Disaster capitalism. I'll do more work on disaster capitalism. Do empirical examples. First is Puerto Rico. They had their natural disaster a couple years ago, which led to a flood of quote unquote outside assistance, which disguised infiltration by market forces and development in the interest of global capital. Second is the 2004 earthquake and tsunami in South Asia. Thousands of locals were forced to evacuate because of the tsunami, then had their land stolen by developers to build resorts or developments. Is specifically true in Haiti. According to the New Internationalist, quote, the Heritage Foundation posted their own set of aid criteria on the website. Quote, in addition to providing immediate humanitarian assistance, the U.S. response to the tragic earthquake in Haiti offers opportunities to reshape Haiti's long dysfunctional government and economy, as well as to improve the public image of the United States in the region. The Heritage Agenda includes countering the influence of Hugo Chavez in the region, interdicting the drug trade, and preventing illegal Haitian immigration to the United States, all of which sort of specifically proves that the sort of Euro-Western agenda in the context of sort of aid and assistance to countries in the global south is sort of part and parcel of the U.S. trying to sort of secure its status as a sort of a global imperialist settler state. It's empirically true. The Clinton administration created a tourist zone in northern part of Haiti with a $55 million deal with Royal Caribbean Cruise Lines, turning an entire Haitian town into a tourist spot. Emergency relief comes with other colonial operations as well. In 2010, after a natural disaster in Haiti, 10 Christian missionaries from the U.S. were jailed for trying to remove Haitian children from the country, which shows that things like emergency aid always come with colonial processes like evangelism and kidnapping of children to quote-unquote more civilized parts of the world, or sexual violence and exploitation by peacekeepers or missionaries. Sexual violence through aid missions is rampant and inevitable. The United Nations Stabilization Mission in Haiti, soldiers in 2011 were convicted of gang raping a Haitian teenager. In 2007, 144 members of a Sri Lankan peacekeeping contingent were accused of sexual abuse, and the UN Office of Internal Oversight Services concluded, quote, acts of sexual exploitation and abuse against children were frequent and occurred usually at night and at virtually every location where the contingent personnel were deployed. Emergency relief comes with peacekeepers/military, and another link is that emergency relief comes with peacekeepers and military presence and sort of military bases that have empirically been used to raid Haitian socialist or revolutionary organizations and groups, which just sort of prove that aid sort of comes with also sort of military presence in the first place. The second link, specifically from the affirmative, is UN credibility. The first argument on the first advantage with that sort of UN credibility is at an all-time low, and the plan sort of uniquely revives that, which just sort of proves that the affirmative is used to increase the legitimacy and global sort of reach of sort of Euro-American organizations like the United Nations, such that they can sort of continue to sort of spread the interests of global capital and increase the exploitation of countries like Haiti. The alternative is militant, decolonial, revolutionary combat. The inherent structure of how colonialism operates means it's the only way to solve, since settler governance is axiomatically and violently oriented towards indigenous elimination. Means settler governance will only relinquish control when violently forced. The Haitian Revolution, Vietnam War, and ongoing Zapatista insurrection all prove that guerrilla combating in settler states is effective in subverting colonial power. All go on to the first advantage. They say that the first advantage is pandemics. The critique turns that for two reasons. The settler colonialism turns pandemics. First is vaccine hoarding. Developed countries like the United States and Europe hoarding vaccines and refusing to give them to countries in the global south like Africa to sort of prove that a settler colonial mindset, sort of just leads to pandemic sort of being inevitable, because even when sort of they do strike, it means that sort of people, poor people in sort of countries outside of the global West aren't able to access military technology, and sort of the underclassing and exploitation of poor people of color in the United States, like African American communities, means that sort of people are never able to sort of get the pandemic help that they need, which sort of makes the spread of pandemics inevitable, which means only the sort of alternative solves, and we control the internal link to that. In addition, no diseases don't cause extinction. First is empirics, first is COVID. It's highly deadly and transmissible, and hasn't even come close. Second is all time with the 833 recorded extinctions since 1500. Less than 4% of those were caused by disease, and none of those species were globally dispersed like humans. Second is vaccines. COVID proves multiple effects of vaccines get deployed quickly. Third is burnout. Even if a disease is deadly enough to cause significant deaths, that means burnout is likely as barriers to travel and contact go up. They say global warming, the cake turns and has access to. This is where as well infinite and accelerating consumption under capitalism is in the sort of chronic exploitation of countries in the global south under capitalism means that sort of there's an infinite exploitation and consumption of natural resources, which leads to environmental degradation, and things like sort of mass consumption and production leads to sort of runaway global emissions, which makes global warming inevitable in the world of the status quo, which means, again, only the alternative can solve. But again, warming doesn't cause extinction. Michael Schellenberger, who's a Time magazine quote-unquote hero of the environment and invited expert reviewer of assessment reports for the IPCC, concludes that the threat of warming doesn't cause extinction. First, there are three warnings. First is media bias. Scientists produce worst-case hypothetical scenarios of future events that range from the most optimistic to the most pessimistic, but media coverage amplifies the direst prediction and casts them as most likely. Second is adaptation. Slow pace of effects like sea level rise means there's plenty of time. The Netherlands proves third is no crisis. The Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN concludes food production will rise substantially, and the IPCC predict GDP will decline just 4.5%. And even the worst case scenarios, the massive also causes warming they can't overcome. First is China. They emit 2.5 times as much as the US. And second is the Amazon. Rapid deforestation is releasing massive amounts of carbon that are independently destroying chances of keeping warming below 2 degrees and 1/10 of the world's capacity to absorb carbon. On the second advantage, the entire critique essentially turns this, but I'll do a couple of arguments on the framing flow. They say that utopian fiat is bad. The alternative isn't utopian fiat because sort of you should reject that logic because sort of means of combating settler violence are sort of always cast as utopian and unrealistic by the settler class, such to sort of defer them. They say seating is the political is bad. There are militarism, militarization all checks that because we recognize that sort of the political will sort of never be mandatory for black and indigenous folks, which means the only sort of way to combat sort of the right wing sort of violent tendencies of the sort of settler colonialism is to sort of invest in militarization in that method and process.
Can we have text before class?
What? The alternative?
All relevant text. I don't know if you read an interpret role about, but yeah, the alternative at the very least.
Yeah, sure. It's just militant decolonization. There isn't like a formal text. If that's what you're looking for.
Wait, there's not a formal
Wait,
text?
just what's the alt then?
Militant decolonization.
Okay.
I can just like copy and paste that.
Okay, so it's going to be 2 off,
or two new sheets, sorry, on the top, and then it's going to be the AF in the order that Alex reads it with the underview on the bottom. I'm not sure. I got a little bit lost where the K ended and Ad 1 began. So once they get to like settler colonialism turns like pandemics, that's going to be on Ad 1, and everything from there is going to be on the AF case. And then it's going to be straight down on the K. Is anybody not ready? Sounds good. Interpretation: the negative must specify the actors of all negative advocacies. The negative must specify the actors of all negative advocacies. The violation must specify the actor that's engaging in militant anti-decolonialism or whatever their alternative is. The first standard is going to be reciprocity, i.e. the affirmative must defend a specific actor on any form of advocacy that we advocate for in a world where the negative doesn't have to do this. This makes debate terminally unreciprocal, which terminally destroys any form of fairness. The second standard is going to be MG skew, i.e. this skews at any particular sticky offense the MG is able to generate in a world where they can just change the actor. They can just say that they're not doing it, or they're having someone else do it, or they're having someone who's really good at combat do it, or having Navy SEALs do it. Indicates that it's always allows for infinite amounts of block shift, which terminally destroy any form of fairness within their own. The third standard is going to be critical education, i.e. that you created any form of process debate about the criticism in the first place in a world where we don't even discuss who is doing your alternative. We don't get any specific clash offense about how we would go out and do your alternative in the first place, which skirts any ideas about how this should actually happen, which is terminally bad for building a resistance skills in the first place, which is particularly bad for portable education. This is going to be voted for fairness. The fairness is going to be determine access within the round. Is to vote for education. Education is the only portable skill that we leave the round with for competing interpretations, because reasonability is always based on a varying definitions of what is reasonable in the software, because we need to be able to understand the rules of the game before we play it. On to the second interpretation. Debaters must provide a trigger warning before discussing sexual violence in round. Debaters must provide a trigger warning before discussing sexual violence in round. The violations that only one to discuss a particular amount of sexual violence that has been committed. The first one is going to be psychic violence, i.e. the triggering the debater causes a form of psychic violence, which certainly skews out the debater because they're not able to they change their physiological response within the round, which means that they're not able to access the round on a physiological level and be able to engage with a particular argument. To be allowing a trigger warning is able to resolve any form of allow for these discussions, but is able to allow these debaters to be able to access the space in the first place, which is particularly good. You can cross by the voters here, but the particular voter for psychic violence is going to be access. I did access, so it's going to be key to being able to have a debate in the first place. On to the AF. Go to the plan. You can extend the UN credibility is low in the status quo, and that we're able to increase the credibility because it shows that we're moving. The UN is moving away from having like peacekeepers do stuff and analyze, and that like natural disaster relief funds are popular within the status quo, which shifts the perception of the UN away from from failed peacekeeping missions and towards being able to fund actual programs that are able to have emergency relief. Go to the impact level. We indicate that this absolutely allows for pandemics. You said settler colonialism turns because of vaccine hoarding. We indicate that the UN and multilateral organizations are the only reason that these countries had access to vaccines in the first place in a world where it's only left up to a particular multinational corporations. There's no way that vaccines are even made available in the first place. The UN has done the lion's share of vaccine distribution, which means that taking UN credibility means that there's no vaccine distribution in the first place. You say that COVID is not equal extinction, but you've conceded the two articulations about H5N5 or whatever the bird flu in Russia is, as well as the Nipah virus, which literally has a mortality rate exceeding 90% in some outbreaks, which indicates that we absolutely will lead to extinctions if we keep letting this happen. COVID is just the beginning. Next, you say vaccines are able to resolve this, but we would indicate that the only way that everybody gets these vaccines is necessarily through multilateral organizations. As you say, you say that extinction has never happened to like species like that has spread as humanity, but we indicate that this doesn't mean that it's not physically possible. But either way, a lot of people die from pandemics. Next, you say global warming isn't necessarily going to kill us. We would say that global warming will absolutely kill us with the eutrophication of the oceans. You've considered the specific analysis. We would say that there's no way that we haven't seen the adaptation in phytoplankton. On the second advantage. You basically concede all of this. You said you're just able to resolve this. I'll do more work on the links of the criticism in particular. But in a world where we just allow for increased amounts of AIDS, and that this UN aid has already been able to help these displaced populations in the first place, is already able to resolve. We would indicate that your historical examples aren't specific to the to just adding to just increasing the funding of the emergency relief programs, which means that we're definitely able to be able to resolve forms of natural disasters. You can extend that natural disasters are particularly dehumanizing. They have been hurting a lot of people because Haiti is specific. On to the overview. You say that you're not utopian fiat. We indicate that utopian fiat is necessarily whether or not you're able to actionably do it. We would say, do you own an AR-15? Do you own any weapons? How are you going to actionably do this? You haven't specified this in a world where you don't even specify your actor, which indicates there's no action, which means that you are absolutely utopian fiat in a world where we literally don't know what you do once the police say, hey, you got to stop doing a military combat, which means that it's absolutely not actual, which makes you totally utopian. But we would also say that you say that the political is never emancipatory. That's unnecessarily fine. You can see this point about that your key to resistance strategies, i.e., that being able to understand your oppressors is particularly a prior question. The U.S. Marine Corps has literally published your literature more than you've read your literature, which indicates that they're absolutely going to understand your method before you are able to. So you better understand how their methodology works in the first place. This is going to be a framing question. That we're far ahead on being able to understand how to conduct the criticism in the first place, which means that the framing of the AF solves the K. On to the F. Oops, I flip this around.
I'm in the K.
The K, sorry. We go drop down to the links. We would say that on the first link of disaster capitalism, we would indicate these are all. This is a very good historical explanation about problems that have happened in Haiti in the past. But none of these are specific to being able to resolve. Are specific to the way that the method that the affirmative uses to resolve. I.e., that none of these sort of preconditions are necessarily specified within the emergency relief fund. We'd also indicate that this is able to resolve this. Next, you say that cholera outbreaks. We're not peacekeepers. We're also not forms of development. I.e., that giving people food and clothing is not necessarily a form of development, which means it's necessarily able to resolve it. There's going to be a pretty good link turn here. The link turn is that we're able to materially aid in in resolving some of the harms of colonialism. Any system that does not materially aid just allows individuals to perform hand washing and create a settler move to innocence. I.e., that if you just talk about waxing poetic about a military combat, but you deny an opportunity to literally go actually help these people and give them homes once their homes have been taken away, you just perpetuate these sort of harms and make the harms of colonialism inevitable in the world, which means you're never able to resolve this. This link turn also particularly outweighs the particularities in a world where the UN is already giving aid. Increasing aid is not necessarily going to absolutely make it so settler colonialism is terminally unsolvable, but it is going to allow us to be able to. It is going to allow us to be able to resolve these things. Just that this particular action is not enough to thump the criticism. Next, you say military presence. We would absolutely we say that we don't increase military presence because there's no peacekeepers that are being sent. I.e., the systems already exist in the first place, which means that we're just funding them more. You say UN credibility is used to increase legitimacy and spread interest. I think I've already implicitly answered this. On to the alt. The first argument I wanted is a permutation do both. Permutation do both is able to resolve the entirety of this in a world where we're literally where the people within Haiti are able to have a better material conditions, be able to engage in revolution in a much a better way, but also that the most vulnerable individuals are able to survive. Indicates that your revolution is always going to be better. But we'd also indicate that there's a pretty good double bind here in a world where your revolutionary militancy isn't able to overcome just increasing money of an already existing program that's probably not able to overcome global settler colonialism, which means you're never able to resolve any of this. Next argument was a revolutionary lag argument where you said you're able to resolve the environment. We're going to indicate you're absolutely not able to resolve the environment. We're 100% over past the brink on carbon in the atmosphere at 104 parts per million. The only way we're going to be able to resolve this is carbon capture. In a world where you engage in revolutionary combat against settler colonialism, there's no way that we have any sort of climate action or climate cooperation, which means that we're never able to sequester the amount of land and use the rare earth minerals that we need to be able to develop carbon capture in the first place, which means that we're never able to resolve this because your revolutionary method takes too long. You're going to be too busy fighting the police before you're able to develop things like carbon capture. Mao, it literally took Mao 50 years to be able to just take over China, which means you're probably not able to resolve it globally. Is there something you want? All right, next argument was key disease. We already kind of made these arguments on the first advantage, i.e. that multilateral cooperation, i.e. the cooperation between multinational corporations like Pfizer and Moderna is necessarily key to being able to vaccine development. Absent this, we're never able to distribute vaccines to the global south, but also we're never able to develop vaccines in the first place. In a world where you literally go to war against these factories because you're trying to get rid of the unification of capitalism, means you're never able to resolve these deadly diseases.
A minute.
Alrighty. It's going to be the two procedurals at the top. The first advantage, then the second advantage, then the critique. Is anybody not ready? On the ASPEC argument, will meet their interpretation that all it is done by revolutionary/socialist groups like the All-African Revolutionary People's Party, or like the All-African Revolutionary People's Party, or our existing revolutionary socialist groups that exist in Haiti in the first place. They could have asked and flexed them. They could have asked to specify and flex time, and I would have. This theory isn't devoted. The net benefit is education because it leads to arbitrary interpretations that get blown up in the middle of debate if they're losing on substance, which decreases the breadth of debate in the first place. Onto the trigger warnings specifications argument. Trigger warning specifications. It's bad to create about what gets trigger warnings, and all of our arguments are talking about violence. It can cause people to have to out themselves if they don't want to hear about these arguments. And trigger warnings are bad in debate because they end up making us take out arguments about sexual violence instead of seeing gendered and sexual violence as a harm we have to interrogate. We agree we shouldn't do graphic depictions of sexual violence. We didn't do that in the first place. Cross apply all the arguments about how spec isn't a voter because of education and decreasing clash debate onto the first advantage. Extend the defense that I did on both the pandemics and the warming scenario. They extend this H5N5 example, but this falls prey to burnout. If it's true that the mortality rate exceeds 90%, there's no way it would spread in a way that's globalized. There's a reason why this type of pandemic has been on the download while COVID has spread globally in the first place, but they haven't specifically responded to a lot of the parts of the specific defense that we did on the question of pandemics in the first place, specifically COVID and specifically COVID, i.e. the fact that if a disease is able to spread enough that affects a large number of people, it's incredibly unlikely that it's able to be lethal enough to cause extinction in the first place, which they specifically considered the burnout, which was the third warrant that I cross-applied to the H5N5 example. They say but I'll extend that the critique is the greatest internal link to controlling pandemics, which we control the internal link to the affirmative. They conceded two examples that that vaccine hoarding means by developed countries means that even if under their model we are able to develop vaccines, they aren't distributed equitably to global South countries, which is why the pandemic is still running rampant in parts of the world like Africa or India and causing many more deaths than in the United States, which independently makes variants that make even the vaccines that we do innovate ineffective, like Omicron, which proves that only through rejecting a settler colonial mindset, or settler colonial politics that favors countries in the global West over countries that are in the quote-unquote global South. The context of preventing vaccines is the only way to substantively combat pandemics, which proves that only the old solves and we control the internal link. This second impact is global warming. I'll extend the defense again. The all causes are. Extend the defense again, specifically to all causes. There's no way for the U.S. to solve global warming, specifically when China emits 2.5 times as much as us, and the rapid deforestation in the Amazon is releasing massive amounts of carbon that are independently going to push us past tipping points. They've also considered our root cause claim about the impacts of warming, about how infinite consumption in a settler colonial/capitalist system makes it so that infinite consumption of resources makes ecological destruction and warming inevitable, because we have to infinitely consume finite resources in order to fulfill the profit motive of capitalism in the first place, which leads to infinite environmental degradation, which is why even though we see that global warming is nearing a tipping point, companies like ExxonMobil are still doing things like drilling in the Arctic and making so that we can't combat global warming, because under a settler colonial system, the profit motive will always come before what's right for everybody, which only the alternative has even a chance of resolving, which means you vote negative and we control the internal entity affirmative. I'll go to the second advantage. Here they say, I'll go to the second advantage here. Utopian fiat debate, they've conceded that the gateway issue that conceptualizations of anti-settler colonial politics being utopian fiat is a link in and of itself, because the settler state always casts attempts to combat settler colonialism as utopian and realistic, such to defer those in the first place. Whenever there's been a substantive movement for things like racial justice or against the settler state, that the U.S. has always cast that unrealistic, or told people or activists to wait or be patient or take their time or be less radical, which just proves that their call to quote unquote be realistic in the context of fiat is a tool of the settler state, and they link to this even more than we do, because we sort of endorse a method. We just sort of endorse a political method, while they sort of endorse via fiat sort of an entire sort of governmental program from the UN, which is sort of far more utopian than just sort of endorsing a political method. They say framing of the affirmative framing of the affirmative is key. That's framing of F. I don't know what that says. It's probably not important. I'll go into the critique. Modernity is fundamentally cohered by the project of Black and Indigenous genocide known as settler society, the global synthesis of anti-Blackness and settler colonialism. The one sees political project of criminal justice reform as a perfection of American settler society, which operates both as an intended liquidation of anti-colonial radicalism as well as the continuing maintenance of settler colonialism. The process of this politic is inevitably the genocide of Black and Indigenous folks, such as secure the total naturalization and sovereignty of the settler through carcerality. Any risk of a link means you vote negative because settler society sanctions the base materiality that enables the one AC's existence, which means any risk of an offense internally linked towards the totality of the one AC. I'll do sort of more of that impact framing work on the one sort of the one and R. They say all our examples are historical, but they're not specific to the APS method. That's not true. We've sort of drawn out specific links as to how sort of the UN themselves say that emergency relief funds specifically is used to do things like sort of fund development for response in countries like Haiti, which sort of proves that sort of quote unquote the emergency relief fund is sort of in and of itself inherently used as a settler colonial project to sort of quote unquote develop countries like Haiti in order to make them sort of more in line with sort of how global capital operates in the first place. They say they materially aid in resolving colonialism. They'll cross-apply. They'll link here about how aid often sort of comes with peacekeepers and sort of military bases that are used to take out or sort of to raid socialist or revolutionary groups that are in places like Haiti, which is independent disadvantage to the perm because it proves that the sort of affirmative politic of aid sort of from Euro Western countries to countries like Haiti sort of is part and parcel with sort of more insidious types of anti-colonial politics, like sort of the transfer of military troops, which sort of proves that the affirmative is sort of actively counter-revolutionary. They say they increased aid, which sort of makes settler colonialism unsolvable, but they're not accessing the sort of root cause claim for things like poverty in Haiti, which is sort of the sort of chronic exploitation of countries in the global south under capitalism. It doesn't matter sort of how much aid we send to countries in the global south like Africa if we're just constantly exploiting those countries for their natural resources sort of in the first place, which just sort of proves that only the alternative sort of accesses the root cause question as to sort of why many countries in the global south sort of sort of experience poverty post sort of colonial emancipation. They say post colonial emancipation, they say peacekeepers aren't being sent. Maybe that's not, maybe sort of the affirmative specifically doesn't send peacekeepers, but if it's true that sort of they endorse a politic of sending aid, that's sort of a part and parcel of the logic of the sort of things like sending peacekeepers. And two, empirically, when aid has been sent, that's always sort of been accompanied by more sort of on the ground troops as well, which means it would sort of be naive to think that the affirmative is sort of sent as sort of an isolated political operation. They say perm to both. All the links that they haven't really touched on are disadvantages to the permutation, specifically the militarism link in the context of the material implications of the alternative, which sort of proves that the affirmative leads to sort of a dissolution of anti-colonial radicalism and brutal counterinsurgency against politics, like the affirmative, which takes out the perm double bind because it just sort of proves that even sort of 1% less efficacy of the alternative post-affirmative means you vote negative because we have these sort of root cause claims, which proves we can evaluate and sort of solve the harms of the affirmative in a way that's sort of far more substantial than the affirmative can. In the context of the world system of settler colonialism, they say we can't resolve climate change because we're past the brink. There's no sort of political will for to do climate change in number one right now, but the climate would sort of probably be the number one priority of the sort of revolutionary group of the alternative, and we solve that better than the settler state because it's motivated by the sort of motivation of trying to help as many people as possible in the world rather than sort of trying to maximize profit, which is why we haven't been able to solve climate change, even though we have the technology in the status quo. They say co-op because they say we like take out companies that develop vaccines. The vaccines, we solve the question of vaccines better because we sort of make sure that those vaccines are distributed equitably and not along sort of settler colonial binaries of sort of who settler colonial binaries of sort of who's considered human and who's considered sort of inhuman and who inhuman, which is sort of why global south countries haven't gotten vaccines yet. We solve that better because we make it so that everyone gets vaccines. Okay, I'm gonna like make one more final argument on like the vaccine question, and then I'm gonna do just like global impact framing on the critique. They say we would dissolve companies that make vaccines. It's not true. That's just all technological innovation stops in the world of the alternative. Technological innovation stops in the world in the alternative. It's just that technological innovation in the world of the alternative would sort of be along the lines of sort of what helps the most people, which turns all their sort of warming and disease arguments, because sort of most of the innovation that happens in the world of the alternative is to try to solve pressing global problems that affect a lot of people, like global warming in the first place. They haven't made substantial responses to the alternative. Here's a bunch of empirical examples of the ultimate effect of the Haitian Revolution, the ongoing Zapatista insurrection, the New People's Army, ongoing war against neo-colonial Philippines, maroon communities within the Caribbean, and the establishment of revolutionary Mozambique are all indicates of militant anti-colonial socialist and or revolutionary otherwise combat being successful, which just sort of proves that the most probabilistic chance of resolving the sort of root causes of all of the affirmatives impacts like disease or climate change is voting negative to endorse the revolution, because they've sort of conceded that the sort of type of militant combat that the negative endorses is sort of the only way to substantially combat the violence of settler colonialism, because the way in which colonial violence is sort of axiomatically oriented towards the elimination of indigeneity, which means only sort of militant combat can try to sort of speak the languages of power and sort of combat against that. I'll sort of do more of the impact work here, even if they're winning sort of a specific link to be able to be the 1AR sort of just going to collapse to sort of we help Haitian people does. You should vote AF, but that's not convincing in this case because we're winning sort of a global uniqueness claim about the root cause of why their impacts are happening in the first place, which means that there's only risk that the alternative is able to sort of solve for these sort of global impacts like disease or climate change or poverty because it's sort of the only way to dismantle global systems like capitalism that makes things like exploitation and the underclassing and exploitation and sort of ignoring of countries in the global south like Haiti, sort of the alternative is the only sort of political method that sort of can resolve that on a large scale way, which means in the world of the alternative, Haiti will sort of be inevitably rocked by natural disasters and sort of will sort of continue to suffer from sort of disinvestment from the international community, even if they sort of still get aid that doesn't resolve for sort of hundreds of thousands of people being killed by natural disasters, but only sort of endorsing the alternative is able to sort of alter the sort of global world system in order to make it so that countries like Haiti aren't chronically neglected by the Euro-American world system that only sort of cares about maximizing the profit of countries like the United States or the Euro-American alliances, which means that sort of we're winning a global claim that sort of turns and independently outweighs the 1AC settler colonialism. On face outweighs the affirmative global extinction of black and indigenous peoples. This leads to tens or hundreds of millions of black and indigenous people empirically and in the status quo being killed or exploited or having to work in horrible working conditions, which is sort of far worse than sort of the affirmative sort of specific impact of just a couple million people in Haiti, even though it's sort of horrible. We're running sort of a much larger sort of global impact question, a sort of much larger global impact as to sort of how settler colonialism operates globally and leads to the sort of to the death and sort of brutal exploitation of hundreds of millions of people, which just sort of means even if you're not buying any of the turn work I'm doing, we're winning that the critique just straight up outweighs the affirmative, which means that which means either A, you can just vote on the critique straight up outweighing because all the great link work we did, or B, you can vote on the critique outweighing plus all of the sort of specific turns case and sort of absorption of the affirmative impacts that we've done, proving that the alternative is the only substantial way to solve for the root causes of all of the impact that they forwarded in this round.
It's trigger warnings, then A-spec. Anybody not ready? Fantastic. Overview of the PMR. Failure to specify your actor is going to be damning. Let's go to the trigger warning sheet. The only thing I have to address here is necessarily the dissent to this articulation that trigger warnings are necessarily bad. The first argument you say is that it forces people to out themselves. We don't necessitate a response. The only warning is still necessarily good, i.e. that it allows people to prepare themselves. We also don't preclude a discussion of sexual violence. You yourself say that it's bad to have graphic understanding or graphic images. We indicated that in a world where we're able to still the interpretation doesn't necessarily preclude the discussion of them. It just allows people to prepare themselves to be able to either take whatever measures they need to do to be able to engage within the space in the first place. Means that this has not actually going to be independent voters would be able to take out the offense that we're going for. Let's go to A-spec. At the top of the A-spec sheet, in a world where you've conceded competing interpretations, there's absolutely no way you're going to be voting negative at the end of the round. For the MG theory sheet is going to be absolutely killer. Let's start with the we meet. Your we meet is literally that you can either be African revolutionary groups or socialist groups in Haiti. Neither you don't even specify which groups in Haiti, which indicates that you're not even specifying your actors, particularly within the we meet itself. This means that there is absolutely no way in which you're specifying your actor either in the LOC or the MO or the LOR. There's no articulation as to why this is necessarily key to being, or why this is necessarily why this necessarily gives us ground to be able to challenge the actor of your alternative in the first place. You say that flex checks, no flex is not checked. A, it's not on the flow. B, even if we asked you, you would have just given us this we meet, which it doesn't even specify in the first place. And C, even we already asked you for a text. You literally said no, there was no text, which indicates there's no specification of an actor out of the LOC. The next argument, or even flex, you say that it's not a voter and a spec is not a voter, particularly the net benefit as education will indicate that fairness outweighs education, and there's not specific, and there's not over specification or the infinite regression of S specification when we literally just specify the when we say specifying the actor is necessarily good. You don't articulate how this proliferates spec arguments. You just say that spec necessarily is all bad. We specifically don't tell you to specify everything. We tell you to specify the particular actor, which is necessarily constrained by the interpretation, which indicates there's no proliferation of spec, and we'll just outweigh this anyway. The drop down to the standards level. The first is the standard I want you to set is necessarily the MG skew standard. Not specifying your actor kills the ability to be able to clash outside of the or clash within the round, particularly because the MG will not be able to not have the same answer, the same things to answer as the PMR. You literally specify an actor in African revolutionaries or socialist groups in Haiti. These are not only there's two giant different groups within different areas of the world, but Gabe didn't have the opportunity to respond to this, which killed all access to the ability to engage within your solvency mechanism in the first place, which means there's no way in which this is absolutely fair. This is the we meet that you articulate is the proven abuse that we're going for. The next argument I want is this critical education argument. You cold concede this particular articulation that process debate is necessarily good for education in a world where we have to debate who necessarily does your alternative, i.e. is it going to be white supremacists taking up arms against the colonial regime? Is it going to be these groups, or is it going to be which socialist groups in Haiti, which African revolutionary groups? You identify specifically like multiple different groups, which necessarily kills any ability to be able to engage within this process education in the first place. We'll also indicate that sublayers any type of education that you're able to garner from the discursive action of the critique in the first place, particularly because we're not able to engage within the understanding of how you're able to resolve your impacts in the first place, which gets me to the a priori. Let's go to the impacts. The first argument I want is a priori, particularly number one, the theory sheet implicates the way you evaluate the alternative. You can't justify voting for the alternative if you don't know what it does, and we haven't had access to be able to contest the solvency. The second is that procedurals will extend the particular argument that Gabe makes. The procedurals set how debate ought to be evaluated and conducted in the first place, which means that procedurals themselves are going to outlayer the critique. The next argument I want is fairness and education. You extend both fairness and education, but fairness is going to come before education, even if they have floating offense on the education articulation, because number one, fairness controls the type of education that we garner. Second, it determines whether people garner education in the first place, i.e. the access question. The third, it determines the access to clash, which means that there's no education post the ability to not be able to clash. We'll indicate the clash is the unique type of education that you get or garner from debate, i.e. that we can all talk about settler colonialism, but in a world where clash is particular to debate, i.e. that we talk about things back and forth with the point of stasis. You are going to evaluating fairness as necessarily a controlling factor in education, which gets me the last two. What else? Competing interpretations. You've conceded that reasonability is necessarily just relies on different definitions of what is reasonable and what is not reasonable, which just leads to judge intervention. You should minimize judge intervention because judge intervention means that the debate actually doesn't matter, particularly because the debate doesn't actually, the rest of the round and the flow doesn't actually depend on, or the decision doesn't depend on the flow. It just depends on what the judge thinks, which is always going to be terminally bad, because then we either don't get education and that's bad. Also, they don't make a reasonability claim, which means that competing interpretation is the only operative framework for evaluating his theory sheet, and they don't even have a competing interpretation, which means you evaluate this as necessarily the only piece of the only way to actually ensure fairness in education in the round. You're going to be voting affirmative on the MG theory sheet. Yeah.
Good round.
Good round.
Yeah.